Okay, so today we're going to start the pies and pastry unit, and I just wanted to take you guys through this short PowerPoint and talk to you about it real quick. I will make this PowerPoint available to you also, but I wanted to walk you through it and explain some things that are not expressly written out here. And there's going to be a couple questions you need to answer just so I can make sure that you guys actually saw this. Okay, so pies and pastries have a lot in common, but when you hear something like that, you probably think of something sweet like an apple or pumpkin pie. However, pies and pastries, both of them can be either sweet like a dessert or they can be savory. So think of something like a chicken pot pie, which is actually a type of pastry because it is a pie, it uses pie crust. The base ingredients for most pies and pastries are the same. So basically what you're going to have is flour, water, and some type of fat, which is usually butter. Besides that, you might have salt. There's probably going to be some sugar in some of them in the dough or the crust itself. But those three ingredients are common to all pies and pastries, your typical ones. So pie crust, we're going to talk about. It's one of the most basic types of pastries. So just by itself, it's going to have flour, fat, and water. There are two basic types of pie crust that we're going to focus on, and it's flaky and they're mealy. They both have the same ingredients. The difference is how you cut the fat into the flour, and I'll talk to you guys about that in a minute. So flaky is just like it sounds. It's flakier, it has more layers. It does better with a filling that isn't very liquidy. So think of like pumpkin pie or other types of custard pies or cream pies, things that don't sit in the filling or sit in the crust with a lot of liquid in it. Mealier is going to be sturdier, so you're not going to have those flakes in it. It's going to be a tougher type of pie crust, and it does better with a liquidy filling than a flaky would. So mealy is good for fruit types of pies. Crumb crusts are another type of pie crust. They're not technically a pastry, but they are very popular, so we're going to talk about those. Typically, they're made with a mixture of butter and the crumbs of a crisp type of cookie. So the most popular ones that people like to use when they're making crumb crusts are graham crackers, Oreos, vanilla wafers, and ginger snaps. And those are usually cooked and then the filling is added to them. And they're very common in cheesecakes. So the three types of pies that we're going to focus on, these are the basic ones, are fruit pies, custard pies, and cream pies. So fruit pies, basically the filling is going to consist of a fruit or multiple types of fruit. So it could be like an apple pie, or it could be a mixed berry pie where you have blueberries and strawberries and stuff like that. There's going to be sugar mixed in with it. There will be liquid, probably it's going to be water. Sometimes it's a juice and some type of thickener. And I'm going to talk to you guys about these in the apple pie demo video that you'll see later on. So thickeners are anything that's going to thicken the liquid that's let off by the fruit as it cooks. So thickeners that are typically used are cornstarch and flour are probably the two most common that are used in pies. Tapioca flour is another type of flour, and then gelatin is another type of thickener that people use in fruit pies. Mealy crusts usually hold up to fruit pies the best, like I said. However, you can use flaky pies sometimes. Um, you just have to make sure that your filling is not too liquidy and that it's not going to be sitting around for multiple days because you don't want the crust to get overly soggy and fall apart on you. Okay, so here are some examples of fruit pies. This is what is called a lattice top crust, so it kind of looks like a basket weave. And then this is just a regular fruit pie with a top and a bottom crust. It's a double crusted pie. So custard pies are when your pie crust and your filling are baked together in the oven. So the filling, it starts out as a liquid, but as it bakes, it becomes a solid. Examples of that are pumpkin, pecan, and then vanilla or chocolate custard pies. Mealy or flaky works well for custard pies because the filling is not liquidy once it's done baking. So it's going to be a solid, and either type of crust will hold up well to it. You can also use a crumb crust with these. Like, people like to put graham cracker crust with pumpkin pie sometimes. It tends to be really good. So here are some custard pies. We have pumpkin, we have pecan here, and then we have a vanilla custard pie or egg custard. All right, so cream pies, this is when your crust and your filling are going to be baked and cooked separately. So some examples are coconut cream, banana cream, and lemon meringue. So the pie crust itself is going to be blind baked. So what that is you put the crust in the oven by itself. So it's in the pie pan. You form it up the sides. You make the little design at the top for your crust so it looks pretty. But then you're going to poke holes all around it with a fork, and you're going to bake it by itself. Some people like to fill it with dry beans and then take them out when it's done baking, and this helps the crust from shrinking down so that it keeps its shape while it's baking. After the crust is baked and it's cooled off and your filling has been cooked on the stove, then you put the two together, and typically these are going to get refrigerated. So a mealy or a flaky crust will work for these also, just because the filling is going to be a solid. It's not going to be liquidy like a fruit pie. So either one would be fine. And these do not have top crust because you cannot bake a top crust by itself and then put it on and have it stay. So here are some cream pies. We have lemon meringue here, banana cream, and coconut cream. So just real quick, I want to talk to you guys about how to make a flaky or a mealy crust. So you're going to cut your fat, which could be shortening butter or lard, into your flour, and then you're going to add water. So when you cut things in, you're taking a pastry blender or cutter, and you're taking some really cold fat, and you're just cutting it in small pieces into the flour. So that lets it be coated in the flour, and then as it bakes, the butter or the fat is going to melt, but it's going to leave those pockets of air in between the layers of the crust. So that's what makes it flaky. So when you make a flaky crust, you're going to have larger pieces of fat, and that's going to leave those air pockets. Mealy crust, your pieces of fat are going to be pretty small. They're going to be evenly cut up, and it's going to not really leave those air pockets. And so it's going to be a sturdy type of pie crust. Okay, so when you guys when I leave this for you, you can click on this link to see somebody making a crust and cutting fat into flour, so you see what that looks like. And I'm also going to show you how to do that in my apple pie video. All right, a few important things you need to know about when you're making pie. If you overtouch or overwork the dough, once you add the water, then gluten starts to form. Gluten is good when you're making bread. It is not good when you're making pie crust. You don't want your pie crust to be stretchy. It's going to end up being tough, and that's not the kind of texture you want for pie. You want to make sure you keep your dough, your butter, your water, everything that you're using as cold as possible to keep that fat from melting before you bake it. If it melts before you bake it, then you're not going to have those air pockets, which are what give you flakiness. If you're blind baking a crust, make sure you poke holes in it so it keeps its shape and it doesn't bubble up while it's baking. And then if you have a top crust on a pie, you always need to make sure that you poke holes or you cut some slits in it so that the steam can vent out while it's baking. That way it cooks properly and you don't have to worry about the top crust splitting apart while it's baking. All right, so the different fats that we can use for pie crust are butter, shortening, which is like Crisco, that's the brand name, and lard. So you guys can see the pros and cons of those. Butter is the one that I choose to use just because of the flavor and it's natural. The con is actually it has a lower melting point, not a higher melting point. So I'm going to fix that by the time you guys get it. The lower melting point is bad just because it's easier to melt it before it gets into the oven. So you have to be careful, make sure you're keeping everything cold. Shortening is good because it has a higher melting point, which makes it easier to work with. So you don't have to be as careful with it as the butter. However, it has no flavor unless you get the butter flavored Crisco, and it also has trans fat, which is not good. Lard is the best because it has the highest melting point. However, it's fat rendered from pigs. So that gives that flavor, like a porkish type of flavor, which means that it wouldn't really be good for fruit pies. However, if you're making a chicken pot pie or something like that, it would be good for that. Some problems you might come across when you're making your pies, your crust might shrink. So what might have happened is that you overworked the dough too much, so the gluten started to form and it became elastic, which caused it to shrink. You didn't use enough fat, so maybe you didn't have enough butter, or your dough wasn't cold enough and the butter started to melt already and then it lost its shape while you're baking it. That's the next one. The crust loses its shape during baking. So your dough could have been too warm, or the dough was overworked. If you have a soggy bottom crust, you have a couple things that could have happened. Your oven wasn't hot enough. You could have had cracks in the crust prior to baking, so liquid seeped through the crust, and then it just, got underneath as well as on top, so it caused it to be soggy, or your filling wasn't thickened enough. All right, so those are some things that I